Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Yes, I'm finally back making daily fantasy football content for the 2024 fantasy football season. So why not go ahead and begin by talking about my top 36 running back rankings. Now, as I progress throughout today's video, talking about each individual running back for about 1 to 2 minutes and presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings, a couple reminders. First and foremost, every statistic that I mention over the course of today's video will be for a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. Additionally, for those of you who are looking for a specific running back, there are timestamps in the description of every single one of my videos, so be sure to go ahead and travel down there if you're looking for a running back. Additionally, while you're down there, if you've yet to do so, be sure to subscribe to the channel, click the like button. I cannot thank you guys enough for continuing to support the channel as we progress to 100,000 subscribers this season. Last but definitely not least, while you're down there in the description, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to take advantage and claim the first-time deposit offer, but you're also going to get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide and rankings sent from my email directly to yours. Those overall draft rankings will be updated every single week, so regardless of when you draft during the month of August, those rankings will be up to date and ready to go. Additionally, those rankings don't stop there, as I'll continue to send you rankings from weeks 1 through 18 of the regular season. Those rankings encompassing all positions, flex, half PPR, full PPR, every single Sunday morning. So for those of you interested in checking out the 2024 fantasy football draft guide and rankings, be sure to use code Andrew today via Underdog Fantasy. And for those of you who are wondering if you're eligible of taking advantage of the opportunity, make sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. Now, for those of you who have perhaps used code Andrew or a different code to make a first-time deposit in prior seasons, you can go ahead and find all this content via the draft guide, the draft rankings, the weekly rankings, and asking me any and all questions via my Patreon, link down in the description. Thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and begin by talking about my top 36 running back rankings with the number 1 running back, Christian McCaffrey, the most complete running back in the entire fantasy football landscape, regardless of scoring format. Besides the fact that he won the 2023 rushing title, he was also top 4 in all major running back receiving categories, whether that's targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, and routes ran. He's the most complete back, and he demonstrated that for the entirety of last season, whether it's the regular season or the playoffs, as he averaged 23.02 fantasy points per game in the 19 games he played in a half PPR scoring format last season. Now, as we progress throughout today's video, the topic of discussion for some of these running backs is going to be age. And considering Christian McCaffrey is going into his age 28 season, many may be thinking perhaps he's going to slow down. Maybe he's going to be more injury prone. But the fact of the matter is, he has dispelled all of those potential thoughts over the course of the last 2 seasons. Specifically last season, his efficiency was at an all-time high. He was number 3 amongst all running backs with a minimum of 50 rushing attempts in terms of yard per carry average. And he was number 8 amongst all running backs within that overall category in terms of yards after contact per attempt. So he's not slowing down in any sort of capacity. And when it comes to health, I know many of you are scarred from Christian McCaffrey of the past, but over the course of the last 2 seasons, Christian McCaffrey has played 39 consecutive games, regular season and playoffs combined. He has demonstrated health. And of course, he's going to continue to dominate for our fantasy team. Now, speaking of health, I want to talk about a running back who came off of an ACL injury and put up the greatest fantasy performance by a running back post ACL since Adrian Peterson, and that's our number 2, Breece Hall of the New York Jets. Like I mentioned, in 2022, tore his ACL, and in 2023, we thought, okay, it's going to be a slow progression of him getting back to his normal self, but quite frankly, it didn't take long. Weeks 1 through 4 of the 2023 season was slow. He only averaged 9.25 touches per game and 6.93 fantasy points per game, but once we got to week 5, Robert Saleh and this offense let him loose. He was averaging 20.15 touches per game from weeks 5 through 18 and 17.29 fantasy points per game throughout that 13-game span. He was the number 2 overall running back in terms of total points and number 3 in terms of fantasy points per game average, only behind guys like Christian McCaffrey and Kyren Williams last season. And you got to remember, this was all without Aaron Rodgers and with a bottom 5 offensive line. And this team has gone ahead and addressed those things going into 2023. You have a healthy Aaron Rodgers, but you also have a healthy offensive line. Besides bringing in free agents like Tyron Smith, Morgan Moses, and John Simpson, who are all going to start within this offensive line, The New York Jets went ahead and used first-round draft capital in the 2024 NFL draft to draft an offensive tackle. So they've gone ahead and addressed their offensive line, which is only going to help Breece Hall. And of course, like I mentioned, Aaron Rodgers returning only elevates this offense, considering the Jets amongst all teams in 2023 scored the least offensive touchdowns, only 22 over the course of a 17-game season. I expect this offense to elevate, and of course, Breece Hall to benefit from the fact that Aaron Rodgers is under center. Now, speaking of a quarterback and offensive overhaul, let's move on to our next running back to complete the S tier. Number 3, Bijan Robinson. Now, in this specific situation with the Atlanta Falcons, going from Desmond Ridder to Kirk Cousins is a huge upgrade, but there's also a huge upgrade in regards to overall coaching and the emphasis in which they're going to utilize Bijan Robinson. You go from Arthur Smith, who was the head coach and primary play caller last season for the Atlanta Falcons, to Raheem Morris, and even though Raheem Morris is a defensive-minded head coach, he's already emphasized this season, we want to hand the ball off to Bijan Robinson as much as we possibly can. We've even heard in interviews this offseason from Zack Robinson, the offensive coordinator of the Atlanta Falcons, that they expect to utilize Bijan Robinson like the Christian McCaffrey of their offense. And quite frankly, he's certainly capable of doing so with his production on the ground and through the air. He demonstrated that last season, and even though he didn't have a huge volume of opportunity because there was a lot of utilization from Tyler Algier, which will dip this season, he can certainly get it done through the air. He was top 6 in all major running back receiving categories, being targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, and routes ran. I mean, when you give him opportunity, he finds success. Last season in games in which he had 15 or more touches, he was averaging 16.0 fantasy points per game. Of course, Bijan Robinson, with the huge upgrades, whether that be quarterback or offensive play calling, is going to benefit for fantasy in 2024. Now, speaking of running backs who benefit from a high volume of opportunity, let's begin our A tier with our number 4, Jonathan Taylor. Now, Jonathan Taylor was a running back just a couple seasons ago that was the number 1 overall at the position. Unfortunately, over the course of the last 2 seasons, he has been riddled with injuries, but last season, the injuries weren't major. They weren't like an ACL or an Achilles that may kind of have us hesitating as to whether we want to draft him. Rather, in 2023, he missed weeks 1 through 4, primarily because of the contract dispute and the fact that he had not been re-signed and he didn't want to play prior to getting signed. Once they inked the contract, in week 5, he was back and ready to go. In weeks 13 through 15 of last season, yes, he did miss time, but it was because of a torn ligament in his thumb. Again, no major injuries to his knees, ankles, anything of that nature in which we have to be highly concerned. So going into this upcoming season, I expect a lot of success from Jonathan Taylor, especially considering what he was able to contribute to this offense last season. From week 7 through 18, he had full reign of this backfield. He was averaging 21.3 touches per game and 16.5 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. With Shane Steichen being the new head coach and primary offensive play caller of this team, it was abundantly clear that they're going to continue to run the ball, regardless of who's at running back, whether it was Zack Moss or Jonathan Taylor last season. Amongst all teams in the National Football League, the Indianapolis Colts were number 6th amongst all teams in terms of running back opportunities. That's a combined total of rushing attempts and targets. So, of course, we expect a lot out of Jonathan Taylor going into 2024, especially with Anthony Richardson back. This offense should be elevated. Now, many of us may be concerned of Anthony Richardson's overall red zone prowess and his ability to go ahead and steal red zone rushing touchdowns. He should be used as the Jalen Hurts of Indianapolis. Now, I do expect this to limit his overall ceiling of production, but I do expect his baseline to be a top 5 fantasy running back regardless of that fact. Now, let's move on to another running back, someone who is also going to be dealing with red zone competition. It is Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions, and his primary competition within the red zone is absolutely going to be David Montgomery, someone who scored double-digit touchdowns last season, and there's going to be competition going into 2024, but I do expect Jahmyr Gibbs to be the number 1 back of this offense, as that's where it trended late last season. Now, when we look back at 2023, weeks 1 through 8, when David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs both played in the same game, because again, there were some games in which either of the two missed due to injury. From weeks 1 through 8, in the 3 games in which they played together, Jahmyr Gibbs was only averaging 7.73 fantasy points per game and only 11 touches per game, having only played 37% of the snaps throughout those 3 games. But once we got past the bye week in week 9 and entered week 10, from weeks 10 through 21, going to the playoffs, we saw Jahmyr Gibbs averaging 14.17 touches per game and 14.92 fantasy points per game, while playing 54% of the offensive snaps. They certainly wanted to utilize him more, and that's exactly what we saw. And going into 2024, I expect and I hope to see Jahmyr Gibbs make that year 2 jump similar to the way that Alvin Kamara did back from 2017 going into 2018. And the reason why I want to bring up, the old Alvin Kamara, Mark Ingram comparison is because Dan Campbell was a coach on that New Orleans Saints coaching staff back in 2017, 2018 with all of this. And he goes ahead and compares Jahmyr Gibbs oftentimes to Alvin Kamara. So with David Montgomery being the Mark Ingram, I hope to see Jahmyr Gibbs make that next step and take over this backfield and have himself a fantastic year behind the number 1 run blocking offensive line in the National Football League in terms of grades and number 4 ranked rushing offense in terms of DVOA. I expect Jahmyr Gibbs to find himself a lot of success in 2024. Now, speaking of elite offensive line play, let's mention our final running back of the A tier. It is Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles, who made a splash this offseason within free agency, joining a division rival within the NFC East, the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, when we compare these two offensive lines, we're talking about Saquon Barkley going from a bottom 5 offensive line in terms of run blocking grades and bottom 5 in terms of rushing DVOA to top 5 in both of those overall categories. I mean, we're talking about the New York Giants in 2023, who allowed their running backs to be stuffed on 23.5% of their overall rushing attempts, which was second worst in the National Football League, in comparison to the Philadelphia Eagles, who only allowed their running backs to be stuffed on 14.2% of rushing attempts, which was the second best in the National Football League. When you improve the offensive line for Saquon Barkley, imagine his level of overall production we are going to see. I mean, he was an RB1 in each of the last 2 seasons behind the worst offensive line in the league. So why not the potential of him going ahead and stepping up with all of the talent that surrounds him in Philadelphia? I mean, just talking about 2022/2023 Saquon Barkley, in the last 22 games in which he has been given 16 or more touches, he's averaging 18.22 fantasy points per game. And I don't bring up 16 touches just randomly. It's because those are the numbers that Miles Sanders and DeAndre Swift have averaged in terms of the last 2 seasons. Miles Sanders in 2022 with the Philadelphia Eagles averaged 16.42 touches per game, and DeAndre Swift in 2023 averaged 17.73 touches per game. I expect a lot of success out of Saquon Barkley this season, and I understand that Jalen Hurts scoring 15 rushing touchdowns last season, 11 of which were from the 1-yard line and the brotherly shove. With Kelsey gone, there may be a potential in which they'll be handing the ball off far more often to Saquon Barkley and finding a lot of fantasy success in that. Moving on to our B tier, and our number 7, we talk about Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams. He was the number 2 overall running back in terms of fantasy points per game last season, averaging 19.92 and a half PPR scoring format, and that was all while he only played 12 games. He did have a 4-game stint middle of the season in which he went onto the IR, and throughout that span of time, yes, the running backs for the Los Angeles Rams were underwhelming in comparison to him, but once he returned, it's like he didn't skip a beat. I mean, having only played 12 games, he was number 3 amongst all running backs in terms of total rushing yards last season. And it wasn't just because of the high volume of opportunity that the Rams were giving him. He was playing 80+% of the offensive snaps last season. It wasn't because they were giving him 20+ touches that he was finding success. It was rather because of how efficient he was. Last season, amongst all running backs with a minimum of 50 rushing attempts, he was ranked 6th in terms of yards per carry average, averaging 5.02. Again, a lot of overall success. Now, going into 2024, I want to use the lessons that I learned in 2023 and establish them once again this season. Because regardless of how long I've been playing fantasy football, I want to continue to adapt. So the primary lesson that I've learned is that we shouldn't go ahead and put too much emphasis on running backs that are selected in the 3rd round that are primarily drafted to be handcuffs/backups. We learned that last season from Travis Etienne taking on Tank Bigsby. And of course, we also learned that from Kenneth Walker taking on Zach Charbonnet. And both Etienne and Kenneth Walker, when they were healthy and they were firing, completely outproduced their overall ADP and proved to everyone that these running backs that are drafted as backups are just that, backups. And I expect that to be the case this season for Blake Corum. So I'm going to continue to invest in Kyren Williams now that there is a discount on his overall value. We know that Sean McVay in this offense is going to continue to find success. Of course, he's been able to support an RB1 in the past with Todd Gurley, and hopefully that'll continue to be the case in 2024 with Kyren Williams. Now, speaking of RB1s of the past, let's talk about someone who has always been an RB1 in every season of their career, Josh Jacobs. And even though he is changing uniforms this season and joining the Green Bay Packers, when he was with the Las Vegas Raiders, this guy was an unstoppable force and an RB1 every season. You go back to 2019. Prior to the injury, he was the number 11 overall back in fantasy football. In 2020, was the number 8 overall back. In 2021, the number 7 overall back after returning from injury. In 2022, the number 3 overall back. and most recently in 2023, the number 11 overall back before the season-ending injury. Now, again, their season was already out of control at that point, so I wouldn't have been surprised if he really just held himself out in order to get healthy and ready for the next season, considering he knew that he wasn't going to re-sign with the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, many of us will look at the overall production of Josh Jacobs in 2023 and point at the fact that he was highly inefficient, but you have to remember he didn't participate in any of training camp because of the holdout, because of the contract disputes. And of course, the Green Bay Packers identified that and went ahead and rewarded Josh Jacobs regardless of that fact, making him the 6th highest paid running back on a per year average. You always want to follow the money because they know that without a camp, of course, you're not going to be as efficient. And it's going to take a while to find success. Yet again, he was still an RB1 for majority of last season prior to his injury. Now he's joining a Green Bay Packers offense who in the past have supported their own RB1, being Aaron Jones. You look at 2019 through 2022, 4 of the last 5 seasons, Aaron Jones has ranked as the number 2, the number 5, the number 12, and the number 9 overall fantasy back. Most recently in 2023, unfortunately, the number 37 overall back because of the hamstring injuries that he sustained. But nonetheless, this offense is going to support another RB1. It will be Josh Jacobs, someone who is capable of being a third down back. Of course, he has demonstrated that in his days with the Las Vegas Raiders, having himself 50 to 60 receptions in single seasons. I expect him to find a lot of success and continue to be an RB1. Now, speaking of consecutive RB1 seasons, let's move on to our next running back who is also changing jerseys, Derrick Henry joining the Baltimore Ravens. So here's the thing about Derrick Henry. Over the course of the last 5 seasons, he has had himself consecutive years in which he has been the number 8 or better running back. I know back in 2021, he did have a season-ending injury in which he broke his foot, but prior to that overall injury, he was the number 1 overall back in fantasy football, and it wasn't even close. I mean, the only reason Jonathan Taylor was number 1 by the end of that season was because Derrick Henry did have his season-ending injury. But as we approach 2024, there may be some hesitation, maybe because he's changing homes, maybe because he's getting older. And I understand that age is definitely a number that we need to look at in regards to metrics at the running back position. But in the case of Derrick Henry, he's a superhuman. Quite frankly, he's a machine. And I don't think age really matters because he's not really slowing down. I mean, just looking at his overall efficiency numbers in terms of yards per carry, yards after contact per attempt, these are still solid numbers across the National Football League when we take into account the fact that he was behind one of the worst offensive lines in 2023 with the Tennessee Titans. He joins an offense that is a run-first approach, has a significantly better offensive line, a mobile quarterback, an incredible fullback, and a top 5 schedule at the running back position. And when we take into account that he's only missed, 2 games due to injury outside of the games that he missed in 2021 with a broken foot, really, he's never had any of these ACL, Achilles issues. He's continuing to dominate, and he's not slowing down anytime soon. Moving on to our number 10, we have Travis Etienne, who had himself a fantastic year, finished as RB3 overall. And I'm going to mention a concept as we progress throughout today's video in the idea of unimpeded volume of opportunity. And that's exactly what running backs like Travis Etienne saw in 2023 and will continue to see in 2024. Amongst all running backs within the Jacksonville Jaguars offense in 2023, Travis Etienne handled 75% of the running back rushing attempts and 80% of the running back targets. Again, that is unimpeded volume of opportunity for a running back who is a 3-down back who has the potential to improve this year and be far more efficient than he was last season within the running game and receiving game. Now, last season, he started out hot, and so did the Jacksonville Jaguars. Their record was 6-2, and throughout that span of time, Travis Etienne was averaging 18.11 fantasy points per game. But eventually, the wheels fell off of this offense. Travis Etienne started to slow down, mainly because of course, Trevor Lawrence getting injured with the ankle and the shoulder and all of that. Their record at the back end of the season turned to a 3-6 team in the final 9 games. And of course, the overall production of Travis Etienne dipped to only 11.4 fantasy points per game. But if this offense can find themselves a steady production over the course of the entire season, not fall off a ledge midway through the year, we should see far more production out of Travis Etienne, someone who averaged 14.91 fantasy points per game in the 17 games that he participated in last season. I know that there's a lot of potential hype surrounding Tank Bigsby that existed last year. And of course, Travis Etienne and his overall production was able to dispel that very early on within the season. Moving on to the C tier, we have Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins. I probably have Devon Achane pretty highly ranked in comparison to the consensus rankings across the board throughout the industry. but I really do love the production and the potential for success for Devon Achane. Now, many of us remember what he was capable of producing back last season against the Denver Broncos, a 49.3-point performance, the 9th greatest fantasy performance by a running back in a half PPR scoring format, going all the way back to 2002, the 9th best. Ridiculous numbers. And even if you remove those 49.3 fantasy points within his overall averages of the 2023 year, in healthy games that he played, he was still averaging 15.69 fantasy points per game, and that's excluding a 50-point influx. Again, ridiculous numbers. And it mainly had to do with this offense and his efficiency within it. He was averaging 7.77 yards per carry, of course, number 1 in the league, and 5.07 yards after contact per attempt, number 1 in both stats, and probably number 1 for as long as I can remember. I dated this back all the way to 2006, and there wasn't a better number. That may be continuing even into the 90s. Nonetheless, Devon Achane should have himself a far greater role within this offense now that he is no longer a rookie, has far more experience, and of course, the coaching staff knows what he's capable of doing. And the role should go ahead and lead to far more touchdowns, especially considering Raheem Mostert last season finished as the number 2 overall running back at the age of 31 within this offense, scoring 21 touchdowns. So if those touchdowns go in the direction of Devon Achane, I'm not saying that he's going to score 20 plus touchdowns, but he should be able to see himself 10 plus within the position, whether it's on the ground and through the air. I do understand that there are injury risks, especially considering how much time Devon Achane missed during the regular season last year. But in comparison to all these other running backs that I'm going to mention, he has the highest likelihood of top 5 upside. Therefore, he sits at number 11. Moving on to our number 12, another player who was an RB1 last season. We have Rachaad White, another one of these young running backs that has unimpeded volume of opportunity similar to Travis Etienne. Last season, Rachaad White handled 75% of the running back rushing attempts for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense and 74% of the running back targets. He is a 3-down back that is going to continue to be utilized at this capacity, regardless of who they bring in. I know that they drafted a rookie running back, but quite frankly, we have seen and we have heard Todd Bowles continue to emphasize that Rachaad White is going to be their RB1. He is going to be their 3-down back. And there, quite frankly, aren't very many running backs like him in the National Football League, according to Todd Bowles. I mean, from week 7 through 18, he really did take over. Rachaad White was averaging 15.91 fantasy points per game. He continued that success into the NFL playoffs, and he really isn't slowing down. This offense played surprisingly well last season with Baker Mayfield, and if they can continue that overall reign of success, I expect Rachaad White to continue to get himself over 250 carries on the ground, potentially 50 receptions once again, and with 300 overall touches, be a top 12 overall back. Moving on to our number 13, we have Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints. Now, while talking about unique running backs, Alvin Kamara is one that has certainly paved the way for many other receiving backs to continue to find success in the National Football League. What Alvin Kamara has been able to accomplish over the course of his entire career, even last season, is quite remarkable. Last season, after he returned from his suspension, of course, missed weeks 1 through 3, from weeks 4 through 16, was the number 2 overall running back in fantasy football, averaging 15.8 fantasy points per game. And that was primarily because Derek Carr loves to check the ball down to his running backs. He demonstrated that with the Las Vegas Raiders offense. If you look at 2018 through 2022, Derek Carr within that offense, he targeted his running backs on a per season basis 114 times per year. So when you go ahead and look at the averages that Alvin Kamara was producing last season, he was on a 17-game pace of 119 targets, 103 receptions, and 655 receiving yards throughout the whole year. Now that you take into account that they're bringing in a new offensive coordinator in Clint Kubiak, he was the former offensive coordinator of the Vikings in 2021, which of course helped elevate Dalvin Cook, and he was the passing game coordinator of the 2023 San Francisco 49ers. He knows how to use Christian McCaffrey, so why not go ahead and use Alvin Kamara in that capacity, which I expect them to do. Therefore, he sits at number 13. Number 14, we have Isiah Pacheco. Again, another one of these running backs that will continue to get unimpeded volume of opportunity. Last season, he dominated 81% of the Kansas City Chiefs running back rushing attempts and 53% of the running back targets. Taking into account that Jerick McKinnon is no longer within this offense, that overall target number should continue to increase. Now, when looking at Isiah Pacheco's overall production from weeks 1 through 22, I'm talking about weeks 1 all the way to the Super Bowl, he was averaging 13.96 fantasy points per game throughout that 18-game span. Found himself a lot of success, and even though he did miss a little bit of time during the regular season, he did return and back to his normal form. And when we talk about the 2024 Kansas City Chiefs, there is a potential in which we should see a huge uptick of overall production. When we look at the 2023 Kansas City Chiefs, they only scored 37 offensive touchdowns. Now, that may be a lot for normal teams, but in the case of the Kansas City Chiefs, that was a down year. The year prior, they had put up 53. The year prior to that, 59 total offensive touchdowns. I expect that the wide receiver additions to this team in Worthy and Hollywood Brown should certainly elevate Patrick Mahomes and this offense and lead, hopefully, to more touchdowns going in the direction of Isiah Pacheco, on top of the fact that he's going to dominate the vast majority of rushing attempts and targets out of this backfield. Now, speaking of hopefully scoring more touchdowns, let's move on to our number 15 and the end of the C tier, James Cook. Unfortunately, James Cook last season only had 2 rushing touchdowns despite all the touches, yet he still was able to finish as the number 11 RB in fantasy football in a half PPR scoring format. But let's talk about why he wasn't able to score these touchdowns. Mainly has to do with the fact that Josh Allen is a red zone fiend. Josh Allen scored 15 rushing touchdowns last season, and quite frankly, throughout his entire career, has scored a lot of rushing touchdowns within the red zone, and I don't think this is going to stop anytime soon, especially with the offensive coordinator change. What we witnessed from weeks 1 through 10 of last season with Ken Dorsey as the offensive coordinator was James Cook touching the ball 14 times per game and averaging 10.57 fantasy points per game. Then we advanced from weeks 11 through the NFL playoffs, weeks 20, and with Joe Brady as the offensive coordinator of this offense, we saw, of course, James Cook averaging 20.1 touches per game and 13.96 fantasy points per game. A huge 3.5 point jump in terms of fantasy points per game on average, and additionally 6 extra touches per game within this offense. So even though he's going to get himself a lot of opportunity, Josh Allen's still going to be that red zone threat, but I do expect a lot of the efficiencies of James Cook to elevate him into this overall standing of being a top 15 running back. Even though, 10 plus rushing touchdowns isn't going to be in the realm of possibility for him this upcoming season, the fact of the matter is, without Stephon Diggs and Gabriel Davis within this offense, it's a run-first offense that is going to run through him. He is the primary offense outside of Josh Allen using his legs and trying to find Dalton Kincaid over the middle. With very little backfield competition in terms of running backs, I anticipate to see James Cook continue to be a top 15 running back in 2024. Moving on to our number 16, we have Joe Mixon, who over the course of the last 3 consecutive seasons within the Cincinnati Bengals offense has been a top 12 fantasy back. Last season averaged 14.18 fantasy points per game, and you got to take into account that half of those games wasn't even with Joe Burrow under center. But this offseason, he was traded to the Houston Texans, and he was made the 7th highest paid running back at the position, and we always want to follow the money because if a team finds that Joe Mixon is extremely valuable to them, it will give us a little bit of an indication as to how much they want to utilize him within this offense going forward. Now, the 2023 Texans looked very different in terms of their overall backfield. They had Devin Singletary there, and their new offensive coordinator, Bobby Slowick, really had to kind of fight his way to running the ball more often late in the season, because when they began the 2023 year, the Houston Texans had 4 of their starting offensive linemen injured. So going into 2024, with a healthy offensive line and Joe Mixon leading the backfield, we should see a lot of success, specifically because what we saw out of Devin Singletary late last season. From weeks 10 through 18, Devin Singletary for the Houston Texans was averaging 19.4 touches per game and 13.17 fantasy points per game. I anticipate to see Joe Mixon dealing with a lot of light boxes in 2024, mainly because of Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Dalton Schultz being within this offense. Should find himself a lot of success within the Houston Texans offense. Moving on to our number 17, we have Kenneth Walker III. Now, over the course of the last 2 seasons, there's been a lot of uncertainty in terms of this backfield because of all of the different moving parts that we have seen. You go back to 2022, it was truly an uncertainty as to whether or not we should trust in Rashad Penny or if we should trust in, a guy like Kenneth Walker. Of course, Rashad Penny, season-ending injury. Kenneth Walker took over and never looked back. We go into 2023. They draft a running back by the name of Zach Charbonnet in the 3rd round. We thought, maybe they're going to split overall touches. That wasn't the case. Kenneth Walker continued to dominate prior to his injury. Now we go into 2024, and there's still a lot of uncertainty because of the new offensive coordinator change and new head coaching change. Hopefully, Kenneth Walker is going to continue to dominate like he has each of the last 2 seasons. Now, when we look back to last season, he was clear and away the number 1 running back of this offense. I mean, when we talk about unimpeded volume of opportunity, he was dominating 77% of the running back rushing attempts and 52% of the running back targets in the 14 healthy games he played with Zach Charbonnet. But when you look at the early half of the season, weeks 1 through 10, he was the number 10 overall running back in terms of fantasy points per game, averaging 14.11 in a half PPR scoring format when we exclude the games in which he left early due to an injury. Kenneth Walker has never ranked below the number 19 overall back in a half PPR, and I don't anticipate him to do so going into 2024. Therefore, I have him as my number 17. Number 18, to close out the D tier, we have Rhamondre Stevenson, who last season prior to his injury was fantastic. He was averaging 11.3 fantasy points per game and was the number 23 overall running back throughout that span of time in one of, if not the most dysfunctional New England Patriots offenses of all time. I mean, we're talking about an offense for the New England Patriots in 2023 who scored the least amount of offensive touchdowns that a Patriots team has scored since the year 2000. That kind of speaks to how dysfunctional the coaching, the offense, the quarterback play was, and of course, that bled into the overall production of Rhamondre Stevenson, but still, he found himself success. Going into this year, we have a new coaching staff, we have a new regime, and we have Alex Van Pelt, the former offensive coordinator of the Cleveland Browns, as the offensive coordinator of the New England Patriots. So this is going to be a run-first team. Head coach Gerard Mayo has come out and he has emphasized on multiple occasions that they want to run the ball first and stop the run, and that's what they're going to key in on in year one. And he says that in every single team meeting, according to Rhamondre Stevenson. And that is hopefully going to be the case. Now, this offseason, Rhamondre Stevenson inked a new deal with this team. So we want to follow the money. And yes, we want to pay attention to the fact that they paid Antonio Gibson a good chunk of money, but they paid far more for Rhamondre Stevenson to continue his services with the New England Patriots offense. You got to remember, going back to 2022, when he was healthy, he was the number 11 overall back by the end of the season, and he was top 5 in all receiving categories at the running back position: targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, routes run. So hopefully the potential for Rhamondre Stevenson, if this offense can elevate far beyond what we anticipate, can get him into that top 15 conversation. Otherwise, 18 is a solid number. Moving on to our number 19 to begin the E tier, we have Najee Harris, who over the course of the last 2 seasons has been a very polarizing figure within the fantasy football community, and specifically amongst all running backs, mainly because of how incredible of a season he had in his rookie year in comparison to what he's been able to produce each of the last 2 seasons. Now, when we go ahead and approach 2024, we have a new offensive coordinator and a huge change to this offense as a whole, bringing in Arthur Smith as their offensive coordinator in comparison to what they had last season with Matt Canada, who was an absolute disaster. When we look at the capabilities of what Arthur Smith was able to do with the running backs of the Atlanta Falcons last year, I mean, the Atlanta Falcons were number 1 amongst all teams in terms of running back rushing attempts. They had 450 last year. So when we take into account the fact that Najee Harris, yes, has had some slow starts over the course of the last 2 seasons, but finished relatively strong last season. From weeks 7 through 18 of last season, averaged 12.51 fantasy points per game, was the number 8 overall running back throughout that span of time, and was number 18 in terms of fantasy points per game on average throughout that span of time, all while splitting touches with Jaylen Warren. So I do anticipate to see a lot of success out of Najee Harris, a running back who hasn't missed a game due to injury throughout his entire career within the National Football League, who is getting a quarterback upgrade in the likes of Russell Wilson and or Justin Fields, depending on who is going to end up, playing within this team. And that's a huge upgrade from Kenny Pickett last season, especially considering the kind of overall splits between Najee Harris when they're in winning efforts and Najee Harris in losing efforts. Last season, in games in which Najee Harris and the Pittsburgh Steelers lost, Najee Harris was averaging 13 touches per game and 6.2 fantasy points per game. In winning efforts, 19.1 touches per game, 13.75 fantasy points per game. Luckily for us, Mike Tomlin has never had a losing season in his entire coaching career, so Najee Harris should find himself a lot of success this upcoming season. Now, while on the topic of Pittsburgh Steelers running backs, let's talk about a former Pittsburgh Steelers running back, James Conner. James Conner last season was hyper efficient. He played incredibly well when he was healthy throughout those 12 games, averaging 19.08 touches per game and 15.28 fantasy points per game. In fact, over the course of the last 3 seasons of his career, within the Arizona Cardinals offense, he has been a top 10 running back in each of those 3 seasons in terms of fantasy points per game on average, and has been a top 20 running back in terms of overall fantasy points in each of those last 3 seasons. So the number 20 overall spot here, in my opinion, is safe. Last season, having missed 4 games, was still able to finish as RB18 overall. And even though many people have concerns about his overall health, considering he's never played a full healthy season, and they did end up drafting Trey Benson as the second running back off the board and in the 3rd round, there may be a potential in which this 3rd round running back may be more than a handcuff and more than a backup if in fact James Conner goes down. With that all taken into account, I do anticipate that if James Conner is healthy and when he is on the field, to be a dominant force, especially considering when we look at weeks 10 through 18 of last season, when Kyler Murray had returned, James Conner was even better, averaging 19.88 touches per game and 16.58 half PPR fantasy points per game. I expect number 20 to be a perfect spot for him. Number 21, we have DeAndre Swift, who is finding himself in a new jersey for the 3rd consecutive year. Went from the Detroit Lions to the Philadelphia Eagles and now is a Chicago Bear. In each of those last 3 seasons, he has been able to produce as a top 24 back, regardless of how much opportunity he's been given and regardless of how much time he potentially misses due to injury. Last season, within the Philadelphia Eagles offense, sure, they're a significantly better offense and had a better offensive line, but in games in which he was given 50% or more of the offensive snaps, he was averaging 13.75 fantasy points per game. There is a lot of potential for DeAndre Swift coming into this offense, not only being the de facto number 1, but being someone who can certainly be a top 20 running back for fantasy purposes, especially considering the offensive coordinator in place for the Chicago Bears. They brought in Shane Waldron, the former offensive coordinator of the Seattle Seahawks the last 2 seasons, who has helped elevate Kenneth Walker to being a top 19 back in each of the last 2 years. So why not someone like DeAndre Swift in an offense that is going to be elevated with a new quarterback, bringing in guys like Rome Odunze, Keenan Allen? It is going to elevate this offense and is going to allow for a lot of light boxes in the case of DeAndre Swift, who is certainly capable of being a 3-down back and certainly one that can find himself a lot of success within the receiving game. I'm not worried about the contributions of Roschon Johnson or Khalil Herbert. I anticipate DeAndre Swift to be a solid RB2 in 2024. Now, speaking of players who are joining new teams, specifically within the NFC North, let's talk about Aaron Jones joining a division rival within the Minnesota Vikings. Aaron Jones, from 2019 through 2022, within the Green Bay Packers offense, was a top 12 running back in each of those 4 consecutive seasons. Throughout that span of time, averaged 15.3 fantasy points per game across 62 games that he played. Again, a lot of success within the Green Bay Packers offense, and unfortunately, that did not continue in 2023 due to his hamstring injuries. But still, at the back end of the season, the final 5 games, whether it's regular season or the NFL playoffs, he was averaging 22.6 touches per game and 18.16 fantasy points per game. We know that there is a lot still left in the tank for Aaron Jones, and that hopefully is going to be able to be utilized within this Minnesota Vikings offense, despite the fact that they are a pass-first offense in comparison to what the Green Bay Packers were doing last season and in seasons past. Now, within a pass-first offense, yes, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for Aaron Jones to find himself receiving success like he did within the Green Bay Packers offense, but we have to take into account that from 2019 through 2022, in terms of overall targets and receptions, Aaron Jones was the number 2 overall receiver just behind Davante Adams within the Green Bay Packers offense. So taking that into account and the fact that he has far more target competition with Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and eventually when TJ Hawkinson returns, his receiving overall totals may not be as high as it was in his days with the Green Bay Packers. He does have the potential, considering his age, to get injured. His hamstrings have always been a problem over the course of the last couple of years, but I still do believe that there's going to be a lot of opportunity within this offense that a lot of people are underrating going into 2024. Number 23, to close out this tier, we have David Montgomery, who last season was a steal within drafts. And that's mainly because many of us saw the writings on the wall. I mean, this was going to be an offense that wanted to run the ball and that signed him and brought him in to exactly do that. And from weeks 1 through 4, in the 3 healthy games he played, he demonstrated that. Having himself 24 touches per game and 19.47 fantasy points per game. But eventually, he found himself getting injured quite often, and because of that, we had to see far more of Jahmyr Gibbs in the back half of the season, but that did not really, diminish the overall production of David Montgomery, considering he had himself, a good volume of touches. From weeks 10 through 21, going into the NFL playoffs, 15 touches per game, 12.91 fantasy points per game in the final 12 games of the season. And quite frankly, I think this is quite beneficial for David Montgomery. Getting less touches is going to lead to him getting far less injuries and is going to keep him, healthy, hopefully for an entire 17-game season. And if he can produce anywhere between 11 to 12 fantasy points per game, he certainly is going to be a top 20 running back in fantasy football. I put him at number 23 primarily because I do anticipate to see an ascension from Jahmyr Gibbs, which is why I have Jahmyr Gibbs all the way at the top at number 5. And I anticipate to see far more opportunities and potential touchdowns go in his direction. But nonetheless, this is an offense that gave their running backs the second most opportunities amongst all teams in the National Football League last season. When you're within the top 10 of that overall category, you can certainly support 2 top 24 running backs. We have seen that over the course of the last 5 seasons of the National Football League. As long as you're a top 10 team in terms of RB opportunity, 2 running backs in the top 24 is a piece of cake. Behind the number 1 ranked offensive line in terms of grades, number 4 rushing offense in terms of DVOA, this should very easily be another season in which we can definitely depend on David Montgomery's overall contributions. Number 24, we have Zack Moss, a running back who is joining the Cincinnati Bengals offense and is filling in some pretty big shoes to say the very least. Joe Mixon from 2021 to 2023 was the number 3, the number 12, and the number 8 overall running back in fantasy football. Now, last season in 2023, as a member of the Indianapolis Colts, Zack Moss proved to everyone that he could be a 3-down back in the absence of Jonathan Taylor. From weeks 1 through 8, he was averaging 16.74 fantasy points per game, was the number 4 overall back in terms of fantasy point production overall, and in terms of fantasy point per game average throughout that span of time was number 7 amongst all backs. He continued to dominate on the ground and, of course, was able to get himself a lot of production through the air as the 3-down back of that offense. Now, once you join the Cincinnati Bengals, you're going to be asked to do a lot within the receiving game, but of course, you're going to have to be behind a lesser offensive line in comparison to what Zack Moss dealt with last season within the Indianapolis Colts. But nonetheless, when we talk about what Joe Mixon was capable of doing last season with Joe Burrow under center from weeks 1 through 11, he was getting himself 18.4 touches per game and 12.5 fantasy points per game. And even though Chase Brown is going to vie and compete for more overall touches, similar to the way that he was late last season, I do anticipate for Zack Moss to fend him off and to stay healthy. In comparison to many of the other running backs that we've spoken about today, Zack Moss really doesn't have much of a mileage on his body thus far in the NFL. He's only touched the ball 570 times in his career, which leads to potential sustainability in 2024 and him being the lead back of a great overall offense. Now, speaking of running backs who haven't seen themselves a lot of touches throughout their career, let's move on to our number 25, Zamir White, who over the course of the first 2 seasons of his career has only touched the ball 136 times. But, like I mentioned earlier, he is the lead back of an offense that in seasons past has led to Josh Jacobs being a top 12 player in every single season of his career. For those of you who are looking for the details regarding that, you can rewind to Josh Jacobs, but nonetheless, Zamir White is entering into a conversation in which he could very easily be a top 15 running back, as long as they continue to give him the opportunities that he saw last season. When Josh Jacobs went down late last season in the final 4 games of the season, weeks 15 through 18, Zamir White averaged 23.25 touches per game and 14.05 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format. And it wasn't because of the overall volume of touches that he was able to find himself fantasy success. It was because of his efficiency on top of it. He was number 8 amongst all running backs last season with 50 rushing attempts minimum in terms of yards per carry average, 4.73 within the back end of that season, and had a 3.43 yards after contact per attempt, which was number 4. These are hyper efficient numbers that are only going to continue for this running back who ran a 4.40 and is 215 pounds minimum. If you guys have seen his offseason videos, this guy looks like he's 240 pounds and is a bowling ball that is going to continue to run over defenders and impose his will. And I anticipate to see that within this offense, especially considering Antonio Pierce, the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders, even last season has said he feels most comfortable when he gives his best players the ball. And he wants to give his running back, whether it's Josh Jacobs or Zamir White in 2023, the ball 20 times per game. And that's exactly what they did, and they found themselves a lot of success. He has even gone to say this offseason that he wants his RB1 to touch the ball 200 to 300 times this season, and I anticipate that's going to be the case for Zamir White this season. Number 26, we have Raheem Mostert, who, again, is coming off of an incredible year. At the age of 31, was able to finish as RB2 overall with 21 total touchdowns being the primary catalyst. And it wasn't just because of the touchdowns that he was incredibly, well off in fantasy. He was quite efficient as well. 4.84 yards per carry, number 9 amongst all running backs, 3.4 yards after contact per attempt, which was 10th amongst all running backs. And though the primary, topics of concern regarding Raheem Mostert are going to revolve around health and age, he has played 31 of the last 34 games throughout the regular season over the course of the last 2 years that he has been with the Miami Dolphins. On top of that, yes, he has been in the league since 2015, but he really doesn't have that much mileage in terms of overall touches in comparison to many of the other running backs who have been in the league since then or even after then. Nonetheless, going into 2024, I do anticipate him to take a step back in comparison to the ascension of Achane. And once Achane gets himself more opportunities, more touches, more goal line work, it will diminish the overall value of Raheem Mostert, who just a couple years back in 2022 was the number 26 overall back by the end of the year. I anticipate him to get himself a lot of opportunities, be a very similar valuable handcuff like a David Montgomery. If anything was to happen to Achane, top 5 upside is certainly within the conversation because we've seen it happen for Raheem Mostert and can certainly take place going into 2024. Now, speaking of valuable handcuffs, why does everyone think that Bijan Robinson Jr. is the handcuff of the Washington Commanders offense? Why does everyone rank Austin Ekeler before him? I don't understand it. Bijan Robinson Jr. was highly effective last season. From weeks 1 through 12 prior to his injury, 15.6 touches per game, and 13.02 fantasy points per game. In games last season in which he played 50% or more of the offensive snaps, was averaging 16 fantasy points per game. Now you bring in a new offensive coordinator in Cliff Kingsbury, which is going to absolutely change this offense for the better. I mean, last season, Eric Bieniemy, it really wasn't a successful offense for a running back because the team as a whole had the most passing attempts amongst all teams in the National Football League, which obviously didn't lend to very many opportunities for Brian Robinson in those capacities. But what we have witnessed from Cliff Kingsbury back in 2020 and back in 2021 as the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals, he can help his RB1 be a dominant force in fantasy. Kenyon Drake in 2020 was the number 14 overall back. James Conner in 2021 was the number 5 overall back. So why not someone like Brian Robinson Jr., who has demonstrated himself a lot of skill, whether it's on early downs or even on third downs. And yes, Austin Ekeler is going to be brought in and is going to be far more utilized than Antonio Gibson was last season, but I don't anticipate that hurting Brian Robinson far more than the number 27 overall ranking. I do anticipate this offense and defense to be overhauled because of the coaching staff and the players that they've brought in, and to see improvements with the second best strength of schedule at the running back position. Brian Robinson should be a great overall player in 2024. Moving on to our number 28, we have Jaylen Warren, who isn't the sexiest name at the position, but he gets the job done, and that's all you really want. You want a running back that is going to average themselves 10 fantasy points per game and is going to be consistent within that flex position, and that's exactly what you'll get out of Jaylen Warren. Jaylen Warren last season from weeks 1 through 18 averaged 9.76 fantasy points per game. Again, a lot of success. And now that you bring in Arthur Smith, the new offensive coordinator, like I mentioned earlier with Najee Harris, Arthur Smith last season, he targeted his running backs the 4th most times amongst all teams, and they handed off their running backs the ball the most times amongst all teams, 450 total. So if that continues to bleed into the Pittsburgh Steelers offense and they lean into the fact that Jaylen Warren needs more touches, someone who was the number 4 running back in terms of yards per carry and the number 4 running back in terms of yards after contact per attempt with incredible numbers, 5.26 yards per carry last season, I anticipate to see Jaylen Warren potentially have even more success in 2024. In comparison to other luxury backup running backs like a David Montgomery or a Raheem Mostert, he doesn't have as much touchdown upside, which does make it difficult. But what he does have, especially in a PPR sense, is receiving upside. In 14 of the 17 games he played last season, he had 3 or more receptions. That is certainly going to make a huge difference within his overall production this upcoming season. And hopefully he gets even more opportunities on the ground considering how effective he has been in that circumstance. Number 29, we have Nick Chubb. So Nick Chubb currently, in my opinion, is my most fluid ranked player who can move on the board at any given moment once we get more information. Obviously had a devastating knee injury last season, tore everything within that knee. And going into 2024, we're still not 100% certain as to whether or not he is going to miss time, whether he'll be on the injured reserve, the PUP list, which is physically unable to perform. We're going to have to keep an eye on this entire training camp to determine that. But if he's going to miss the first 4 to 8 games, of course, that will lower his ranking accordingly, and Jerome Ford will be in this conversation. But as it currently stands, I mean, we're coming off of a season in which we saw Breece Hall tear his ACL, then finish as a top 5 running back in fantasy football. And if there's another running back that can kind of vie for that overall position to be very similar to Breece Hall or Adrian Peterson in their first year to return from an ACL, I would assume that Nick Chubb is capable of doing it considering how great of a talent he is. But again, in a run-first offense, they might not want to go ahead and put all of the workload on his back at the beginning of the season. They might have to wait and slowly integrate him within the overall scheme. We'll have to wait and see how the information develops over the next couple of weeks. But as of right now, a solid RB3 going into this year. Number 30, we have Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary for the Texans last season, from weeks 9 through 20, going into the NFL playoffs, once he had fully established himself as the starting running back of this team, and we saw the disappearance of Dameon Pierce, he was averaging 18 touches per game and 12.18 fantasy points per game. In games in which he played 50% or more of the offensive snaps within the Houston Texans offense, 12.77 fantasy points per game. And yes, he has very big shoes to fill within this New York Giants offense, filling into the shoes of Saquon Barkley, who handled the entire backfield opportunity. I mean, last season, Saquon Barkley consisted of 87% of the running back rushing attempts and 72% of the running back targets. Devin Singletary has an unimpeded volume of opportunity, and quite frankly, I do believe that the number 30 ranked spot is low considering how many touches he may see this season, especially considering there really isn't much backfield competition. I mean, the only running back competition he has is Tyrone Tracy, who is a 5th-round running back rookie. Again, it should be Devin Singletary's entire backfield. He is familiar with the scheme. He played for Brian Daboll back when Brian Daboll was the offensive coordinator of the Bills from 2019 through 2021. Throughout that span of time, Devin Singletary ranked as the number 31, 34, and 20 overall back in fantasy football. So number 30, not a bad spot. Moving on to our number 31, we have Jonathon Brooks, rookie running back of the Carolina Panthers, the first running back taken off of the board in the 2024 NFL Draft. One of the primary reasons he was a third-round selection in the 2024 NFL Draft was because he tore his ACL last season, so he still is in the road to recovery. But when we talk about running backs who were selected within the third round since 2019, in the last 5 seasons, we have seen 17 running backs selected in the third round. There have been 16 running backs who played their rookie year that were healthy, ready to go. Of those 16 running backs, 1 was an RB1, 1 was an RB2, and 3 were RB3s. That's 5 of 16 running backs. That's only a 31% success rate. There have been even lower success rates when you compare running backs who were drafted in the third round and joined offenses that already had an established top 30 running back in terms of fantasy production, aka Chuba Hubbard. But if in fact Dave Canales truly does believe in Jonathon Brooks, the plan is to eventually make him the starting running back of this team and allow him to be a 3-down back, regardless of the fact that Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders exist within this backfield. We got to look at the fact that Dave Canales, the offenses he has been associated with over the course of the last 2 seasons, Seattle and Tampa Bay. In Seattle, he helped Kenneth Walker produce as a number 16 overall back, and last season, a guy like Rachaad White finishing as the number 7 overall back. So why not Jonathon Brooks coming off the ACL, still being a top 30 overall producer? Number 32, a running back who is joining a new team and is coming off of 2 back-to-back seasons of being a top 15 fantasy prospect at the running back position, but unfortunately is going to most likely have to split time going into 2024 with Tyjae Spears. You go from an elite offense that was scoring nearly on every drive to one that now, unfortunately, is still in flux. We don't know what Will Levis is truly capable of. They have a new offensive coordinator and head coach in Brian Callahan coming from the Cincinnati Bengals, but we know that the Cincinnati Bengals didn't like to run the ball much. They were within the bottom 5 in terms of running back rushing attempt categories. So going into 2024, with the split of Tyjae Spears and Tony Pollard, I do expect Tony Pollard to still be the primary number 1 and 3-down capable, but I do expect his overall lack of touches to lead to him being a lower end RB3 within his overall investment. Moving on to our number 33, we have Austin Ekeler, who, again, just a couple seasons back, 2021, 2022, was a top 2 running back in both those seasons for fantasy purposes. And yes, he is one of the most decorated receiving backs in fantasy football history. I think he has the record for the second most receptions all time within a single season, only behind Christian McCaffrey. I think he had 107 receptions within a single year. Going into 2024, we're going to see a lot of production out of Austin Ekeler as a receiving threat within this backfield, mainly because of what we've witnessed within Cliff Kingsbury offenses when we look at 2020 and 2021 within the Arizona Cardinals. Back in 2020, Chase Edmonds, even though Kenyon Drake was a top 15 back, Chase Edmonds finished as RB28 because of his receiving overall production. In 2021, even though a guy like James Conner was the number 5 overall back, Chase Edmonds, the number 35 overall back in a half PPR scoring format. We have seen over the course of the last 3 seasons in which Cliff Kingsbury has been the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals, he targeted his running backs 100, 103, and 112 times. We're going to continue to see a lot of opportunity go in the direction of Austin Ekeler, who hopefully can be far more efficient than he was last season. Moving on to our number 34. Honestly, I do believe that Javonte Williams should probably be in the G tier, but quite frankly didn't fit. Javonte Williams has an opportunity to continue to be the lead back, and I understand that last season he struggled mightily in terms of overall efficiency, considering he was coming off of the ACL, had gained a little bit of weight. But this season, he has an opportunity to find himself a lot of success within an offense that wants to give their running backs a lot of opportunities with a rookie quarterback in Bo Nix who can potentially, just continue to check it down as every single Sean Payton offense does. But there are still a lot of uncertainties in terms of running back usage. We have guys like Samaje Perine, Jaleel McLaughlin, Estime, who they drafted this offseason. There is a lot of competition, and until we see a clearer picture as to how they're going to utilize these, 4 running backs, who they're going to cut, potentially maybe it's Samaje Perine, who's a cap casualty. We'll have to wait and see. Hopefully, it's not a running back by committee situation, but very similar to last season, it very well could be. Moving on to our number 35, we have Gus Edwards, who is replacing Austin Ekeler as the lead back of the Los Angeles Chargers. He goes from one Harbaugh brother to the other, going from John to Jim. And the fact of the matter is, we're also seeing a guy like Greg Roman, who used to be the offensive coordinator for the Baltimore Ravens from 2019 through 2022, go back to his former head coach, where he was an offensive coordinator for the San Francisco 49ers back from 2011 to 2014. So Greg Roman, a Harbaugh brother, Gus Edwards, it's a formula that we have seen find success before in the past. When you go back to 2019 through 2022, when Greg Roman was the offensive coordinator of the Baltimore Ravens, they gave their running backs an average of 355 rushing attempts per season. And even though we are seeing this offseason a split between Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, you got to remember that J.K. Dobbins is coming off of an Achilles injury, and Gus Edwards is going to get the bulk majority of the first team touches. And yes, there will be a split, and that's why I have him at number 35, but I do anticipate him to get a lot of volume in a run-first offense. And yes, he's not going to score 13 touchdowns like he did last season within a dominant, Baltimore Ravens offense. This is going to be a far lesser offense within the overall system for the Los Angeles Chargers, but he is still going to get himself a lot of opportunities on the goal line to find himself success. Moving on to the final running back of today's video, we have Ezekiel Elliott, who, very similar to Gus Edwards, should be splitting overall touches with a guy by the name of Rico Dowdle. Now, last time we saw Zeke in 2023 as the starting clear number 1 running back after Rhamondre Stevenson's injury within the Patriots offense, weeks 13 through 18, we saw Ezekiel Elliott handle 20 touches per game and 13.32 fantasy points per game. And now that he returns to the Cowboys and there is no Tony Pollard as he has gone to the Tennessee Titans, there is a potential in which we could see the 2022 Zeke return. From week 6 through 17 throughout that span of time in 2022 as the starting running back of the Dallas Cowboys, he averaged 17 touches per game and 14.96 fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, he had a 9-game streak of 1 rushing touchdown minimum. There is a potential in which Zeke could get back to his double-digit, touchdown form within the Dallas Cowboys offense, but it's probably less likely than we anticipate. He finishes the number 19 overall back in 2022 when, a guy like Tony Pollard was still in the top 10 of that conversation, but still, I do anticipate Zeke to have himself a far lesser role. He has a lot of touches under his belt, and his age is definitely getting there, but maybe he can go ahead and surprise all of us and be far better as the number 36 overall investment at the running back position. Okay, that covers the running back conversation in terms of our top 36 rankings and tier list. Thank you everybody for watching. If you enjoyed today's content, be sure to go ahead, click the like button down below, subscribe if you haven't yet already. I know this was a long video, but that's the entire purpose. I want to try to give as much information as I possibly can regarding each running back so I can justify their overall ranking. But as this summer progresses and as the month of August goes into the regular season, I'm going to talk about these running backs even more, and I will share far more details in individual running back videos that will go ahead and give you guys a greater understanding as to why I rank them as such. Thank you everybody for watching. Until next time, which will be tomorrow, talking about the wide receiver position at a top 36 capacity. Thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.